take on this abnormal shape, they also become very sticky and very abnormal. They may regain their shape some, but they don't regain their normal function, and they start to interact with blood vessels and cause inflammation and cause tissue damage and obstruction. So this tiny, simple mutation that leads to terrible complications with poor circulation throughout the whole body, from the brain to the kidneys to the lungs, heart, everything that requires blood flow, the ankles and ankle ulcers, things like that. So there's a lot of different problems that happen if you don't have enough adequate blood flow and oxygen to your tissues. The reason it exists is because in Africa and a few other areas of equatorial parts of the world, like in India and Southeast Asia, but mainly in Africa and India, this sickle cell trait, which is just one gene, not both genes, one gene from one of the parents, protects from malaria. So it helps people survive malaria somewhat better. It's not a great protection, but it's a somewhat of a protection. And so the gene survived in Africa and India and a few other places because it provided some protection to the population. So more people who had sickle cell trait actually did a little bit better than people who didn't have sickle cell trait.
Wow.
Sickle cell disease doesn't protect you at all. Sickle cell disease is a very bad condition. It's just the sort of evolution. The people who develop sickle cell disease suffer quite a bit, so the people who have sickle cell trait would survive better. It's sort of an unfortunate but survival of the fittest. This actually was a protective mutation. Nowadays, we have much better medicines for malaria, so it doesn't provide any use now, but it did provide use back in ancient times or old times when people didn't have access to any medicines for malaria.
Wow.
So, no, I'm just saying there's several other mutations that also have a similar protective or a different protective effect for malaria. Things like thalassemia and other variant hemoglobins and red cell abnormalities that are almost all much more common in people of equatorial populations, whether it's Southeast Asia or Africa or India, and all of these are driven by malaria. Outside of these zones, the equatorial zones, the gene doesn't really exist. In far northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere, there's no advantage to these things, so they rarely persist because there's no advantage to them. But they were helpful in Africa and India, etc. So now that we have learned a little bit more about why this gene occurs, what we're finding out more in the last 20 years or so is that it's not just the anemia and blocked blood flow from these red cells. Like, they're not like logs blocking up a dam. These are cells that circulate around and cause